Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of different types of content relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already, then please do hit that subscribe button down below and don't forget to turn on your little notification bell so you know whenever I upload a new video. So for today's case, I'm back discussing one known as the Hall Mills murders, and obviously I'll go into all the details about the case and everything that happened later on in the video, but for now I just want to say a big thank you to our sponsor of today's video, which is Skillshare. As I'm sure you know if you're not new to my channel, this is a place all about education, and Skillshare is the perfect sponsor for this, as it's just this one big online learning community with thousands of classes on countless topics. It's a community where creatives can come together and just further their passions through their classes on loads of different topics. So you've got all the practical things like photography, you've also got interior design, there's music, there's really honestly everything you could want to look for on Skillshare. Since they are the sponsor of today's video, I thought I would let you guys know which class in particular I've been loving recently, and it's actually a video class called The Ultimate Guide to Creative Planning and Journaling by Amanda Rach Lee. And I've been a huge fan of Amanda's YouTube for years now, and I was so happy to stumble across her video classes that she was posting on Skillshare, so that's something that I've been absolutely loving. I'll leave a link to that one down below in the description just in case you want to check out as well. And what I love the most about Skillshare personally is that everything fits completely into your schedule, and especially because most of the classes are less than an hour long, so you really don't have to clear like a huge chunk of your day just to watch one of these classes. As like I said, I'm sure you know if you aren't new to this channel, this is a place where we share a love for education, and so I really do believe that Skillshare is a great way for us everyone, for you guys and myself obviously, to build on this love of education and be creative with it really. And obviously with them being the sponsor of today's video, they are bringing a special offer just for you guys. So the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in my description will get a free trial of the Skillshare premium membership, so you can just explore your creativity yourself. To those of you who do decide to make the most of this offer, I would love to know which Skillshare classes you recommend, which you've been enjoying recently, so feel free to leave them in the comments below. And one big final thank you to Skillshare for being the sponsor of today's video and showing your support for the channel. So before we get into the case, I'm just going to whiz through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things. I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just go ahead and get started discussing the case of the Hall Mills murders. On September the 16th of 1922, the bodies of a man and a woman were discovered in a field near a farm located to the Middlesex County and Somerset County border in New Jersey. The remains had been discovered by a young couple who had been taking a morning stroll when they'd stumbled across the unsettling sight underneath the tree. The bodies were identified by the authorities as being that of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills, a discovery that initially appeared to raise eyebrows since Mills had not been the wife of the other victim. The bodies were found lying on their backs with gunshot wounds to each of their skulls from a weapon determined to have been from a .32 caliber pistol. Edward Hall had only been shot one time, whilst Eleanor Mills was found to have suffered a total of 3 gunshots. It was also noted that Mills's throat had been cut so severely that she had almost been decapitated, and it was determined that the pair had likely been killed in the previous day or so. So the pair were found lying beneath each other underneath a crabapple tree, with a hat covering Hall's face and ripped up love letters being scattered between them. The pair were fully clothed, and the male victim's right arm had been placed underneath the female victim's head, with the female victim's left arm having been placed on the man's right knee. And by the feet of the male victim had been a business card belonging to Reverend Edward Hall, which had aided obviously the identification of the remains, as well as there being a wallet found nearby containing his driver's license. Investigators had started looking into the last known movements of each of the victims, beginning with Eleanor Mills. On the evening of the 14th of September, 2 days prior to the discovery of the remains, Mills was known to have left her home on Carmen Street in New Brunswick for an unknown reason. Her husband, James Mills, had not been told where she was planning on going, nor had she told either of their children, but they had all witnessed her leave the home at around 7:30 p.m. As investigators would soon find out, Eleanor was actually headed to an arranged meeting with Reverend Edward Hall, the other victim, at their local church. As it would turn out, in the year prior, Hall had actually loaned Mills some money for a kidney surgery, as her and her husband could not afford it at the time. And so this meeting had allegedly been arranged in order for the pair to discuss her repaying him some of the money that she had borrowed from him. Prior to that arranged meeting, it's known that Edward Hall had had dinner with his wife, Frances Hall, and her brother, William Stevens, before then leaving his home around the same time as Eleanor Mills left hers. Hall had in fact told his family that he was heading to the St. John Evangelist Episcopal Church, where he was a minister, and he informed them that he wouldn't be long before returning home. When there was no sign of her husband by around 2:30 a.m, Frances Hall went to her brother William and asked him if he could join her in going to the church to check up on him. When they arrived at the church, they found there to be no sign of anyone and none of the lights were on. Since they were aware of Hall having been meeting up with Eleanor Mills, they instead decided to head to the Mills family home just to see if he was still there. This house was too entirely dark, and because of the late hour, they didn't want to wake the family, and so they decided that they would head back in the morning if there was still no sign of Edward by that point. And when there remained no sign of Edward Hall by that afternoon, Frances ended up contacting the authorities and reported him as a missing person. So based on the pile of ripped up love letters that was found in between the remains, it was very quickly determined that the two victims must have likely been having an affair, and this knowledge had introduced a new avenue of investigation into potential suspects. There were many issues in the early days of the investigation, in particular in relation to the scene of the discovery of the remains. Due to its public nature, there were a number of groups of hunters who would travel through the scene of the discovery completely unaware of them potentially compromising evidence. But in addition to this accidental compromising of evidence, there were also a number of local residents who had shown some sort of morbid curiosity into the case, and they would travel to the scene and take pieces from the area just to take away with them as little trophies. So because of this, by the following month, there was virtually nothing left of the crabtree but a stump on the ground. There was no murder weapon found at the scene of the remains, although it was considered the possibility that one of the unusual fans of this crime had taken it away as a souvenir. Similarly to this, the business card that was found with the remains had been handled by a significant number of people during that period of time in the initial investigation, so they weren't able to determine a lot from that either. But from the investigators' perspective, there appeared to be two people in particular that they needed to focus their investigation on, and these were Hall's wife Frances and Mills's husband James. They learned relatively quickly that the affair between the victims was particularly well known by the local residents. However, this didn't include their spouses, and both denied having known of it. It seemed that the investigators still had their suspicions, and these soon turned to not only Frances Hall but also her brothers William and Henry Stevens. William Stevens in particular was known by the locals as being a rather hot-headed man with quite a temper, and he also happened to own a .32 caliber revolver which appeared to match the murder weapon. Although when he was questioned, he claimed that the gun had not been used in over 10 years. Despite these claims, the authorities had proceeded to examine the weapon, and they soon discovered that it hadn't been used for quite some time, so much so that they couldn't even get it to work. Henry Stevens, the older of the two brothers, was known to be a particularly wealthy man for the time. He was also considered as an expert in knowledge of firearms from his previous experience of being an exhibition marksman. Investigators had considered the possibility of this brother being the one to have actually pulled the trigger, but because of the distance between his home and New Jersey, combined with the fact that he could provide an alibi supported by several individuals, it seemed rather doubtful. And then, 3 weeks following the discovery of the remains, while the investigators were still looking into the movements of their persons of interest, they discovered something specific relating to the victim's wife, Frances Hall. They discovered that less than a week after the death of her husband, Frances Hall had sent a number of pieces of clothing to a store in Philadelphia where she requested that they be cleaned and dyed black. Despite being unusual, this wasn't necessarily anything criminal, and so investigators had continued on their search for the killer. On the 24th of October, a woman named Jane Gibson contacted the police, informing them that she had witnessed the Hall Mills murders. Gibson was a pig farmer, and when media outlets had caught wind of her witness statement, they soon coined the name Pig Woman for her. So Gibson stated that at around 9 p.m. on September the 14th, she was alerted when she heard her dogs aggressively barking very suddenly towards her property. She had initially assumed that the dogs were alerting her that someone had entered onto her farm and they were attempting to steal her crops, and so she went outside to investigate, which is where she spotted a figure in the distance. As she headed in the direction of the figure that she had seen, she travelled closer to the crabapple tree where the remains would later be found. She said that she kept her distance, but she was able to see a group of 4 people all stood near the tree when she suddenly heard a gunshot. She saw one of the people drop to the ground and then she heard a woman scream, "Don't." Gibson claimed before seeing another person fall to the ground, and she claimed that in fear she fled from the scene before one of these individuals could spot her. But as she started to flee on her mule, she heard another scream from a female saying "Henry." Despite the details of this account seemingly matching the details of the discovery, authorities still remained rather skeptical about trusting it fully. They remained convinced that this story just didn't quite fit, and they'd also believed that Hall in particular had been shot while he was lying on the ground, so this wouldn't really match up with the story that Gibson had provided. In addition to this initial doubt, they also found that every time Gibson had told her story to a different investigator, she appeared to slightly alter it or even add little details, so it varied slightly each time. Initially, Gibson had told the authorities that due to it being dark out that evening, she'd only been able to see some silhouettes in the distance by the tree, but she later told an investigator that she had also seen a car parked nearby, and when a car had driven down the road located nearby, the headlights of this passing vehicle had temporarily allowed her to see a good enough look of the 4 people stood under the crabapple tree to gain a description. And she said that when this occurred, when this passing car's headlights had sort of illuminated these people, she could see that there had been 2 men and 2 women, and that one of the women had been wearing a long coat while one of the men had bushy hair and a moustache. She then later added more details to her account, including that she had heard an argument concerning a set of notes before witnessing one of the 2 women attempting to run away from the group but being caught by one of the others. When this woman was brought back to the group, her and one of the 2 men were shot. In another account of that night, Gibson had told an investigator that she had returned to the location where she had witnessed the incident around 1 a.m. the following morning, since she had dropped something while she was initially there during this first sighting. And upon returning to this spot some hours later, she looked towards the crabapple tree and saw a woman knelt down beside the male victim crying. And Jane Gibson had confidently identified this woman as being Frances Hall. It is worth noting, as I said, that there were a number of issues with Gibson's accounts, including a number of inconsistencies, but this isn't entirely unheard of when discussing the reliability of eyewitness statements. Another woman named Mrs. Fraley had also come forward as a witness to the murders, whose account appeared to place further doubt in that of Gibson's account. This Mrs. Fraley had lived in a home that was the closest location to the murder scene out of all the local residents, and the spot by the crabapple tree where they had occurred could be seen from one of her upstairs windows. When authorities had spoken to her in relation to anything that she may have potentially seen or heard on the night of the murders, she had informed them that neither she nor her guest that was in her home that night had heard any gunshots. And this had placed great doubt in the likelihood of Jane Gibson having heard gunshots, considering she was located further away from the scene where she had allegedly witnessed the crime. Mrs. Fraley had also stated that she had actually spoken to Jane Gibson herself the morning after the murders, and she had not mentioned anything of the murders to her. These murders that she was claiming to have witnessed the evening prior, which she believed was completely unlikely, considering how this Gibson would usually love to gossip with her neighbours. However, Mrs. Fraley's account of that night would soon change. Just a few days after Jane Gibson had claimed to have seen Frances Hall at the scene of the murder, she had also named Frances' cousin Henry Carpenter as being one of the men that she had seen. Carpenter was also local to the area, and he lived just 2 doors down from Frances. When he was questioned following Gibson's identification of him, he had informed investigators that he had an alibi of being out for dinner with his friends and his wife at the time of the murders, and this was seemingly supported by some witnesses. On the 20th of November, a trial began in front of the Somersville Grand Jury, and over a period of 8 days, a total of 67 witnesses were called to provide evidence, one of these being Mrs. Fraley. She had initially created doubt on the account provided by Jane Gibson by claiming that she had heard nothing on the night of the murders, but During the trial, she'd stated that she had heard multiple gunshots at around 10 p.m. that night. It's not exactly known why the witness had changed her testimony, but nonetheless, it happened. On November 28th, Jane Gibson had provided her statement, following which the jury had begun their deliberation. The result of this deliberation meant that the prosecution had not been successful in winning an indictment, and the investigation into the Hall Mills murders would come to a halt for nearly 4 years because of this. On July the 3rd, 1926, authorities were notified of a petition for divorce being filed between a man named Arthur Reel and his wife Louise Geist. Inside the petition, it stated that Reel's wife had accepted $5,000 from her boss in exchange for her help and silence relating to the Hall Mills murders. And this woman was employed by Frances Hall, Reverend Hall's wife. Geist had worked as a maid for the Halls, and she had also been one of the individuals who had testified in defence of Frances in 1922. Reel had informed the authorities that his wife had told him that Edward Hall had confessed to her about his plans on eloping with his mistress, Eleanor Mills. But her husband was not the only person that she had told of this confession, as she had also told Frances Hall of her husband's plans. Louise had told her the specifics of where the pair had planned to meet, and Frances had then allegedly asked her chauffeur to drive her and her brother William to this same spot. When questioned, both Louise Geist and the driver had denied having knowledge of the murders prior to the public announcement. On July 28th of that year, Frances Hall and her brothers William and Henry Stevens and her cousin Henry Carpenter were all arrested for the murders of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills. Around the same time, prosecutors had ordered another autopsy to be carried out on Mills's remains, which discovered new information. They'd found that her tongue and her larynx had been cut out completely. The trial of Frances Hall and her two brothers had started on November the 3rd, 1926, while their cousin was initially to be tried separately but ultimately was never tried at all. During the trial, Jane Gibson was once again a key witness for the prosecution, and she had arrived being carried in on a stretcher as she had allegedly fallen ill in the few days before the trial. Before she was even able to begin her testimony, her own mother had shouted from the gallery of the courtroom, calling her a liar. The statement Gibson provided was once again rather inconsistent with the initial accounts provided in 1922, including the new claims that she had witnessed seeing Frances' brothers alongside Frances and Carpenter that night. And Gibson's testimony was picked apart, including one neighbour of Gibson's named George Spiel, having testified that she had actually offered him money in exchange for him supporting her claims in trial in public. It was also pointed out that up until that point in time where Frances Hall's photograph was distributed amongst local newspapers, Gibson had been completely unable to identify any of the suspects. The prosecution had provided evidence that there was a partial fingerprint belonging to William Stevens on the business card found at the scene, although it was proven that there were numerous other prints found on the very same card because, like I said, so many people handled it in the early days of that investigation. There was another local resident who had claimed to have seen Henry Stevens near the area of the murders, and this individual's name was Ralph Gosline. But Gosline, interestingly, was also a previous lover of Eleanor Mills, and he claimed that when Stevens spotted him, he had fired 2 warning shots in Gosline's direction before he had fled. So if this testimony was indeed accurate, it would beg the question of why Gibson had only heard 4 gunshots instead of 6. Another person who provided a statement during the trial was a man named Henry Dickman. Now, Dickman was a former state trooper, and he claimed that he was paid over $2,000 by Henry Carpenter, so Frances Hall's cousin, in exchange for the promise that he would purposely drop any investigation into both the Hall's family and the Carpenter family in relation to the murders. However, Dickman's credibility was soon destroyed when the defence announced that he had only just been released from Alcatraz, where he was sentenced as a military deserter. Both Frances Hall and William Stevens had both maintained their innocence in the murders, and Stevens even had numerous witnesses who could confirm his alibi on the night of the 14th. And the trial continued on for a total of 1 month, where there were a total of 157 witnesses called to give statements. And then on the 3rd of December 1926, the jury deliberated for 5 hours before reaching a verdict. They had found Frances Hall and William and Henry Stevens innocent. And the case of the Hall Mills murders had been one that was much discussed over the years, as people's opinions appear to be just completely divided on it. While some people remain adamant that Frances Hall and her family were guilty of the murders, and this had been mostly because of the motive of the affair, knowledge of the affair, others have also come up with their own theories and suggestions. Since it was such a widely publicised case at the time, there have been many false confessions over the years, something that whenever I mention an incident of in any of my videos, I always say I just will never understand why people falsely confess to open crimes. A widely suggested theory is that Jane Gibson, or the Pig Woman as she was known by the newspapers, was actually the one responsible for the murders. Now this is obviously only a theory, but this theory mainly stems from the knowledge that her account of the night had changed so many times and there were so many inconsistencies that people have suggested that it might be indicative of her involvement and her desperate attempt to shift the blame away from herself. In terms of a motive for Gibson being the one to have killed the pair, nothing obvious really seems to appear. It's been theorised that perhaps she killed them accidentally, once having mistaken them for trespassers on her property, and then staged this intricate crime scene after the fact in an attempt just to confuse the investigators. But this doesn't really appear to line up with the murders themselves, as the injuries found on Eleanor Mills in particular seem far too violent to have been the result of an accident. They seem particularly personal. Some have suggested that perhaps Gibson was a previous lover of Edward Hall's and had acted in some sort of sense of revenge, but this once again doesn't really have any evidence to support it. Although following this same sort of line, it does seem possible that maybe one of the pair's previous lovers could have had some sort of involvement or at least motive, and it seems a popular theory that these investigators hadn't really looked into these particular individuals enough. But yes, that is where I'm going to end today's video. As always, please do let me know your thoughts, because this is definitely an interesting one, and like I said, it does seem to really divide people. A huge thank you to Skillshare for being the sponsor of today's video, and like I said, if you guys want to make the most of the fantastic offer that they're bringing you guys, I'll leave all the information and the link in the description below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.